The lights in the studio warmed the air as the cameras rolled, capturing the moment. Two distinct voices in American justice and politics took their seats. Jasmine Crockett, assertive, unflinching, and grounded in her civil rights legal background, sat across from Judge Frank Caprio, the compassionate and widely admired figure known for blending empathy with the law. Between them sat a moderator, but the real weight of the conversation hung between their ideologies. The question posed was direct and unavoidably charged. Is the American legal system racist by design or merely by practice? It was a question America had asked repeatedly, but rarely with two figures so different, so principled, and so unwilling to retreat from a difficult truth. The moderator invited Crockett to begin. She inhaled deeply, then launched into her argument with clarity and a conviction that came from years of watching disparities unfold in real time. She explained that America's legal system was not built in a vacuum, but was created in a period when the foundational laws of the nation openly classified black and indigenous people as less than equal. If you build a system during an era where racism is not just tolerated, but encoded into the very fabric of daily life, she said, how can you expect that system to somehow evolve into neutrality without a full reconstruction? Her words were not simply rhetorical. They carried historical weight. She traced the origins of American policing to the slave patrols of the South, whose explicit role was to maintain racial order and enforce the violent boundaries of slavery. Crockett continued, pointing out that after the Civil War, the black codes and later Jim Crow laws were used as legal mechanisms to continue controlling black Americans. She argued that the legal system, from sentencing disparities to resource distribution, still bore the fingerprints of those early racist policies. Her voice sharpened as she described how crack cocaine offenses were punished far more harshly than powder cocaine offenses for decades, even though the law disproportionately punished black communities. To her, this was not accidental. It was structural. It was baked in. Judge Caprio listened intently, hands folded, his eyes reflecting that rare quality of simultaneously disagreeing and deeply respecting the person speaking. When the moderator turned to him, he leaned toward the microphone with calm assurance. Caprio began by acknowledging America's shameful racial past, something he did not hesitate to condemn. But he argued that condemning the past was not the same as defining the present. The legal system, in his view, had been built on constitutional ideals far larger than the flawed humans who operated within it. The Constitution, despite its imperfections and historical context, provides mechanisms for equality, fairness, and justice. He said, "The failures you've highlighted, Congresswoman, are not because the system is inherently racist, but because certain individuals throughout history have applied it unjustly." He explained that laws themselves evolve, sometimes slowly and imperfectly, but the structure of the legal system allowed for change, challenges, and corrections. Caprio pointed to moments in history where the system upheld equality: Brown v. Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act, and countless judicial decisions that expanded civil liberties. "You don't get those outcomes," he said, "from a system designed to oppress. You get those outcomes from a system that can be misused, but also has the capacity to correct its course." He didn't deny disparities existed, but he suggested the root of those disparities lay more in socioeconomic inequality, poorly funded communities, inconsistent representation, and implicit bias, rather than in the legal system's design itself. Crockett responded quickly, refusing to let the distinction slip by unchallenged. If a system consistently produces racially unequal outcomes, she said, I don't care whether you call it design or practice. The effect is the same, and if that pattern persists for generations, then at what point do we stop blaming individuals and start examining the structure? She emphasized that unequal school funding, discriminatory policing patterns, jury selection biases, and wealth-based barriers to quality legal defense were not random occurrences. These disparities persisted because they were built into the framework of American institutions. Crockett added that even when laws changed, the practical implementation of those laws often reflected older biases. Caprio responded by stressing his lifetime of observing people in his courtroom. He said that while he witnessed injustice, he also witnessed laws applied fairly, compassionately, and without prejudice by countless judges across the nation. If the system were inherently racist, he said, then how could fairness ever occur within it? How could justice ever be served regardless of race? He argued that race disparities often correlated heavily with poverty, not because the system was designed to target race, but because economic inequality placed certain groups at higher risk of entering the system. To Caprio, the system's biggest flaw was not racism, but inefficiency and inequality in resources. Fix poverty, and you fix most of what people point to as systemic racism, he suggested. Crockett pushed back strongly, noting that poverty itself in America was racialized by design. Communities were segregated, denied generational wealth, and excluded from equal access to housing and education through explicit laws like redlining. Saying the system targets poverty instead of race, she said, is like saying the fire targets the dry wood instead of the match that lit it. In her view, the legal system didn't just reflect racial inequity, it helped maintain it. She highlighted how prosecutors disproportionately charged minorities with harsher crimes and how pretrial detention affected poor defendants, who were disproportionately people of color. Crockett argued that even algorithms used in sentencing risk assessments showed racial bias because they were based on historically biased data. Caprio acknowledged these issues, but insisted they were outcomes of misapplication rather than inherent design. He pointed out that judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials had enormous discretion in how they used the laws. The system is a tool, he said. A tool can be used to build or to harm. Blame the carpenter, not the hammer. He reminded the audience that many reforms in America came through the legal system itself. Judges ruling against discrimination, lawmakers revising outdated statutes, and courts overturning racist laws. Crockett countered that a system requiring constant correction for racial bias might be fundamentally flawed. She argued that repeated reforms indicated that the underlying problem was structural, not incidental. She asked Caprio how many more decades of unequal outcomes needed to occur before society admitted that racism wasn't just a matter of bad actors, but a legacy coded into the mechanisms governing law enforcement and justice. As the first part of their debate drew to a close, the tension between them crystallized into a clear philosophical divide. Caprio saw the system as a neutral framework that could be corrupted or redeemed based on those who wielded it. Crockett saw the system as a structure built on inequity that required more than surface adjustments. It needed fundamental transformation. Both agreed the status quo was unacceptable, but they profoundly disagreed on why it existed and how deeply its roots penetrated the foundation of American law. The cameras resumed recording after a brief break, and the tension between Jasmine Crockett and Judge Frank Caprio felt even sharper than before. The moderator thanked both for their passionate opening round and invited them to explore the core of the question more deeply. This time, the focus turned toward real-world examples, moments in American history and modern society that either reinforced Crockett's argument of structural racism or supported Caprio's belief that the failures came from inconsistent application rather than flawed design. Crockett began by citing a series of landmark studies. One examined traffic stops, revealing that black drivers were disproportionately pulled over compared to white drivers, even though contraband was found more often in cars driven by white motorists. She explained that these patterns persisted nationwide, regardless of geography or political leadership. When a disparity appears everywhere, she said, you're no longer dealing with a few bad officers. You're dealing with norms, systems, training, expectations, and unspoken rules that produce the same results again and again. She argued that this wasn't incidental, it was structural, and she emphasized that courts often upheld these policing patterns, offering broad legal protections that made reform almost impossible. Judge Caprio acknowledged the disparities but challenged the interpretation. Bias can be widespread without being designed into the law itself. He said, social norms influence behavior across professions. The question is whether the written law demands bias or whether society's prejudices leak into how the law is used. He insisted that if the law truly mandated racism, there would be no legal pathway to challenge biased policing, no federal civil rights lawsuits, and no successful suppression of discriminatory practices. The fact that the system permitted such challenges and often ruled in favor of victims of discrimination reflected its design for fairness, even if many failed to honor that design. Crockett countered by pointing out that the legal successes he cited were reactive, limited, and often came only after decades of protests, legal battles, and public suffering. You're describing exceptions as proof of the rule, she argued. A system designed for equality would not require generations of marginalized people to beg for basic justice. She referenced cases where courts allowed racial bias to slip by unchallenged. She described algorithms used in sentencing that consistently gave higher risk scores to black defendants because the inputs, past arrests, neighborhood crime rates, employment history, were all shaped by structural racism. If you build a tool on top of biased data, you get biased output. She said, that's not a glitch. That's a structure. Caprio leaned forward, taking a moment to reflect. He said that while statistics highlighted troubling disparities, he had seen countless judges work tirelessly to avoid racial bias in their personal rulings. He insisted that the American legal system gave judges discretion, so they could apply empathy and fairness individually. To him, that discretion was proof the system wasn't inherently racist. If the system forced racist outcomes, he said, I would not have been able to rule with compassion for the people who stood before me, nor would thousands of other judges who approach their work with fairness. He asked Crockett whether she believed every judge, prosecutor, and police officer acted with racial prejudice. She shook her head before he even finished the question. Of course not, she said, but isolated good actors don't redeem a harmful system. Crockett shifted the focus to the prison system. She laid out statistics demonstrating that black Americans represented a disproportionately high percentage of the incarcerated population. Even when controlling for income, education, and location, sentencing disparities persisted. She highlighted the crack powder cocaine sentencing gap again, which for decades punished black communities far more harshly than white ones engaging in similar drug use patterns. This wasn't a matter of practice, she said. It was written into law, it was intentional, and the effects are still with us. Caprio acknowledged the injustice of the crack laws, but reminded the audience that those laws were eventually overturned because the system allowed lawmakers and judges to correct mistakes. To him, this reflected an evolving system rather than a racist one. He argued that the legislative process itself was flawed, too slow, too political, too reactive, but not inherently designed to target racial groups. Bad laws can be passed in any system, he said, but in a racist system those laws would remain. Here we fix them, sometimes too slowly, sometimes imperfectly, but they do change. Crockett shook her head, noting that the pace of change was itself revealing. Communities harmed by discriminatory laws waited decades for relief while generations suffered. Even when reforms arrived, they came with caveats. Many people incarcerated under old drug laws were not automatically released or resentenced. Families remained broken. Economic damage lingered if your car's alignment is off. She said, "You can replace the tires all you want. You'll still drift off the road. You must fix the structure." She argued that America had spent decades replacing the tires of minor reforms without repairing the underlying alignment. Caprio replied with a story from his courtroom, describing a young man who had been fined for a minor traffic offense. The man was black, unemployed, and caring for his mother. Caprio forgave the fine after listening to the circumstances. "The law said he owed hundreds of dollars," he said, "but the system gave me the discretion to grant compassion." He used this example to illustrate that in practice, the system could support humane decisions rather than racist ones. "If a judge can choose mercy," he said, "then the system isn't forcing discrimination." Crockett appreciated his humanity, but argued that one judge's mercy did not negate the experiences of millions who faced harsher treatment. She described a young black teenager in another state whose life changed forever because a judge felt compelled to impose the strictest penalty for a petty theft. "It depends on who you get," she said. "Why should justice depend on luck? Why should someone's life be shaped by the qualities of the judge they happen to stand in front of?" She explained that if a fair outcome depended on an individual rather than a structure, then the structure itself was flawed. The moderator stepped in to probe deeper, asking both participants whether reforming police training or restructuring sentencing guidelines could address the gaps between design and practice. Crockett argued that training couldn't fix a system built on historical inequity. Reform had to include rewriting laws, reevaluating the purpose of policing, and removing financial incentives from criminal justice, such as fines, fees, and for-profit prisons. Caprio suggested more pragmatic reforms: implicit bias training, increased resources for public defenders, standardized sentencing guidelines, and community-centered policing. This led to another clash. Crockett insisted reforms should be structural, transformative, and far-reaching. Caprio emphasized practical, immediate changes that could save lives today. She argued that small fixes would never address a deep-rooted problem. He argued that sweeping transformations often failed because they lacked political feasibility and public support. Both agreed that racial disparities existed, but the divide between them remained wide. Crockett believed those disparities were symptoms of design rooted in history, codified across institutions, and perpetuated through structures. Caprio believed the disparities emerged from practice, poor execution, flawed policies, and societal prejudices that seeped into the legal system but did not define it. The studio grew quieter as the final segment began, almost as if the weight of everything said so far pressed down on everyone in the room. The moderator made it clear that this last part would focus not only on diagnosing the problem, but on presenting solutions. The question on the table was no longer just, is the American legal system racist by design or by practice? But also, what must be done now? Both Jasmine Crockett and Judge Frank Caprio understood that this final stretch was where their philosophies would collide most intensely. Crockett leaned in first, setting the tone with a sense of urgency. She explained that America could not meaningfully move forward without acknowledging that the justice system contained the shadows of its creation, shadows still visible today. She said that while many argued the system wasn't racist anymore, disparities in sentencing, policing, and incarceration were too consistent and too deeply rooted to be dismissed as coincidence. For Crockett, the only real solution was redesign, not repair. She described the system as a house built on faulty land. You can repaint the walls, replace the windows, and even install new plumbing. She said, but if the foundation is cracked, everything you build will eventually fall back into the same pattern. Her vision involved structural reform, eliminating cash bail, demilitarizing police departments, requiring body cameras nationwide, abolishing for-profit prisons, guaranteeing equal funding for public defenders, revamping jury selection processes, and rewriting sentencing laws to remove racial disparities that had endured for generations. She also emphasized the need for community investment, better schools, economic programs, mental health services, and housing support, arguing that these were inseparable from justice. A system that punishes the symptoms but ignores the causes, she said, is not a justice system. It is a cycle. Caprio listened carefully, nodding at many of the issues she outlined, but his response took a different direction. He acknowledged that America faced serious disparities, but he urged caution against framing the entire legal system as fundamentally racist. In his view, doing so risked undermining public trust in a system that, despite its flaws, provided essential protections like due process, rights of the accused, the ability to challenge unlawful actions, and the constitutional foundation that had enabled many civil rights victories. If we label the entire enterprise corrupt or racist at its core, he said, we run the risk of eroding faith in the very tools required to fix it. Caprio advocated focused, targeted reforms, what he called pressure point reforms, rather than full reconstruction. He supported many of Crockett's ideas, such as ending cash bail for nonviolent offenses, expanding public defender budgets, and addressing sentencing disparities. But he insisted that solutions must be rooted in practicality, political feasibility, and respect for the parts of the system that did work. He argued that many judges, attorneys, and public servants were doing their best within a structure that allowed fairness, even if it wasn't always delivered. We cannot discard every brick because some are cracked, he said. We must replace the broken ones and reinforce the structure, not demolish the entire building. Crockett challenged this view strongly. She said that incremental reform had been tried for decades and that the same problems persisted because the underlying architecture encouraged them. Community policing initiatives came and went. Sentencing reforms came and went. Training programs came and went. Yet racial disparities remained almost identical over generations. If someone keeps patching leaks in the same pipe, she argued, and the leaks keep returning, you don't buy more patches. You replace the pipe. She questioned why America was so hesitant to rebuild the system from the ground up when it had done so in areas like the military, technology, education, and transportation. We rebuild airports, but we won't rebuild justice, she asked. We update software every year, but we won't update a system designed in the 1800s. Crockett insisted that boldness was not only necessary, it was overdue. Caprio acknowledged her frustration but said the comparison was flawed. The justice system wasn't a product or a facility. It was a social contract shaped by hundreds of millions of people. Rebuilding it entirely, he said, required consensus that America simply did not have. He also warned that sweeping changes could create instability or unintended consequences. When you tear down a system without a unified vision, he said, you risk creating a vacuum, and vacuums fill unpredictably. He argued that the most immediate improvements came from strengthening oversight, increasing transparency, and ensuring accountability, not from throwing out constitutional frameworks. Crockett countered by saying that fear of disruption had been used for generations to resist change. She pointed out that abolitionists had once been called dangerous radicals. Civil rights activists were labeled extremists. Even Martin Luther King Jr. had been condemned by large portions of the public before being celebrated decades later. Every transformative movement looks impossible until it becomes inevitable, she said, and justice that depends on patience is rarely real justice. The moderator interjected, asking each of them directly what a fair future would look like. Crockett went first, describing a system that recognized humanity over punishment, one where equal access to lawyers, fair sentencing, unbiased policing, and economic opportunity were foundational rather than aspirational. She imagined a system where prisons focused on rehabilitation, not revenue, where data transparency prevented discrimination, and where police departments were held to consistent national standards instead of operating under thousands of differing local rules. She believed fairness required rethinking everything, from who gets arrested to who makes the laws, and ensuring that no part of the system profited from suffering. Caprio followed with his vision. He pictured a system where fairness came from empathy, discretion, and humanity. A system that trusted judges to consider life circumstances as much as legal codes. He wanted greater investment in public defenders, more community engagement in policing, and clearer sentencing guidelines to eliminate disparities. But he also wanted the public to remember that justice could not rely solely on institutions. It relied on people. A perfect system will still fail, he said, if the people within it don't uphold the values it represents. Their visions, while different, shared common elements: fairness, transparency, accountability, and humanity. Yet the philosophical divide between them persisted. Crockett saw the structure as the root of injustice. Caprio saw the structure as salvageable but suffering from human flaws. She believed in rebuilding, he believed in reforming. She saw generational harm requiring generational transformation. He saw human error requiring human correction. As the debate drew to its final moments, the moderator invited each of them to make a closing statement. Crockett spoke of the families she represented, those who had suffered under discriminatory laws, and the pain she witnessed firsthand. She said America owed them more than apologies. It owed them action. Caprio spoke of the people he had encountered in his courtroom, individuals he had tried to treat with fairness and compassion, and he urged America not to lose faith in a system that still held the potential to deliver justice. The cameras faded out on a stage where disagreement had not prevented dignity, where argument had not prevented mutual respect. The debate ended not with resolution, but with a deeper understanding of how complicated the question truly was. And yet, despite their differences, one truth was clear. Both Crockett and Caprio wanted a system that lived up to the ideals it promised, even if they fundamentally disagreed on how to achieve it.